My name is Alyssa King. I am 28 years old. I was sitting at the far end of a long, pushed-together table at a waterfront restaurant in Miami, watching my dad raise a champagne glass as the sun dropped behind the bay, when he slid a manila folder in front of me and said, "All that's left is Alyssa's signature." And then Morgan and Noah officially own Kings Harbor Grill. My older sister Morgan leaned into her fiancé Noah Clark, already accepting hugs like a brand new CEO. My name was printed at the top of the document as majority owner, and my dad expected me to sign it away between appetizers and dessert. When I didn't grab the pen, he added under his breath, "Don't start, Alyssa. Don't ruin their night." If you've ever sat through a family dinner and realized you were only invited to hand over something you built, tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you want to hear exactly how this exploded after that night, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. 3 days before that dinner, I was standing in my tiny Edgewater apartment, microwaving leftover arroz con pollo when my dad called. He skipped hello. "Kings Harbor finally has a real future," he said, like he'd been practicing the line. "Your mom and I decided that, as an engagement present, we're giving the restaurant to Morgan and Noah so they can start married life on solid ground." He talked about fresh energy and keeping it in the family like I hadn't already done that. When I stayed quiet, he kept going. "We'll have the paperwork ready at the celebration. Just sign where your name is and don't bring your attitude. This is a happy moment." There was a time when news like that would have knocked the air out of me, and I still would have smiled and said I was proud of my big sister. To explain why that version of me was gone, I have to tell you how Kings Harbor Grill became the center of our world, and how I ended up paying to keep it from sinking. I grew up in a narrow two-story house in a working-class neighborhood just west of downtown Miami. But the place that shaped me more than anything was a low, whitewashed building on the river with Kings Harbor Grill painted in fading blue letters. My dad lived for that restaurant. He called it a Miami institution even when half the tables were empty and the roof leaked every time a storm rolled in. My mom moved constantly between the kitchen and the dining room, hugging regulars, smoothing over mistakes, topping off sodas, keeping the place from feeling as stressed as it really was. Morgan, 4 years older than me, was always introduced as our future boss. She got dance lessons, private SAT prep, and a used convertible for her 16th birthday. I got hand-me-down uniforms rides, bummed from friends, and the same line from my mom whenever I asked for anything extra. "You're so independent, Alyssa. You don't need as much help as your sister does." By high school, I had learned to measure my requests carefully. When there was money for one senior trip, Morgan went to New York to broaden her horizons, and I stayed home to cover weekend shifts at the hostess stand. When my dad talked about sending someone to an out-of-state university, it was always, "When Morgan gets into somewhere special," while I quietly filled out financial aid forms for Miami-Dade College. I took business classes during the day and answered phones at a cruise line call center at night, listening to people scream about lost luggage while I did mental math about what rent I could afford if I moved out. Morgan bounced between majors, tried a semester of marketing, then a semester of journalism, then came home for a while to figure things out. She drifted into teaching yoga and posting glossy photos of her life online. My parents described her as creative and visionary, the person who would someday take Kings Harbor to the next level, even as vendors started calling more often about unpaid invoices and chairs in the dining room wobbled when customers sat down. The year everything cracked, Miami had one of those brutal hurricane seasons you feel in your bones. Flooding wrecked the parking lot, tourists dried up, and one of the big refrigeration units died right before a holiday weekend. My dad took out a small business loan to cover repairs and payroll, then opened a line of credit when the payments hit harder than he expected. By then, I had moved into a tiny studio off Biscayne Boulevard, working full-time in operations at the cruise line and slowly climbing out of the cubicles. I still came in on Sundays to help with inventory. I noticed the way my parents' voices shifted whenever the office phone rang, how my mom's shoulders tensed every time my dad answered and said, "Tell them I'll call back." One afternoon, he left to drop something at the bank, and my mom went to the market, leaving me alone to finish counting liquor bottles. I went looking for printer paper in the back office, opened the wrong cabinet, and found a thick bundle of envelopes held together with an old rubber band that snapped when I picked it up. The return addresses were all some version of the same story: banks, the Small Business Administration, the county tax office, vendors I recognized. Most of the envelopes were still sealed. I sat at my dad's dented metal desk and opened them one after another, feeling my stomach drop with every letter. There were past due notices stamped in red, warnings about unpaid property taxes and possible liens on the building, polite but increasingly sharp demands from suppliers who had been told the check is in the mail too many times. By the bottom of the stack, I was staring at numbers that added up to more than $400,000 in debt tied to Kings Harbor Grill, and phrases like risk of foreclosure that didn't leave room for denial. I could have shoved everything back in the cabinet and told myself my parents were adults who had made their choices. Instead, I flattened the envelopes into a pile, pressed my palms on the desk, and started calculating exactly how far I could stretch my life to keep a bulldozer away from the only place my family had ever been proud of. That night after closing, my parents slid into a corner booth with me like they had when I was a kid doing homework between dinner rushes. I laid the letters out in a neat line. No tears, no drama, just paper. My dad tried to act annoyed. He said banks used scary language, he had a plan, things would turn around. His eyes kept flicking away from the big red stamps. My mom went quiet in a way that told me she had suspected things were bad, but hadn't seen the numbers. "We didn't want you stressed about this," she said, as if listening to debt collectors wasn't my daily job already. I told them exactly what I made, what I had saved, how I could refinance my car, cut my expenses, maybe pick up more hours. If we moved quickly, they might be able to restructure the loan instead of losing everything. My dad hated the idea of anyone else knowing how deep he was in, but my mom had already called her brother, my Uncle Stanley Moore, who ran a small chain of hardware stores and had watched people lose businesses by pretending problems didn't exist. When he heard I was offering real money, not just sympathy, he showed up with a different kind of fix. A week later, I was in a bank conference room that smelled like stale coffee and cheap carpet, watching my dad shrink a little across from a loan officer and an accountant. Stanley sat beside me with a legal pad full of notes. He pushed for a clean structure, the way he might negotiate a supplier contract. The building and the business would be rolled into a new limited liability company, King Harbor Hospitality LLC, with me as majority member on paper. The refinanced loan would rely heavily on my credit and come with a personal guarantee from me, something I did not say yes to lightly. My parents would hold smaller membership shares as long as payments stayed current, and they followed the new budget. My dad muttered about his own father never needing all this legal nonsense when he opened his diner decades ago, right up until the banker slid the final packet of documents across the table and said, "Without your daughter's backing, this doesn't happen." He signed. My mom signed. I signed not because I had always dreamed of owning a restaurant, but because the idea of watching Kings Harbor get auctioned off in some boring county proceeding made me feel sick. The next 3 years of my life snapped into a narrow routine that almost nobody saw. I took every overtime shift the cruise line offered, traded my small studio for an even smaller room with a roommate to cut rent, sold my little hatchback, and memorized the bus schedule. I picked up a part-time bookkeeping gig helping a group of food trucks keep their books from sliding into chaos. Every month, big chunks of money left my accounts and landed in the loan portal for King Harbor Hospitality. Between my savings, my cashed-out retirement account, and the payments I made over time, I ended up putting close to $200,000 of my own into that place and guaranteeing nearly $200,000 more. At the restaurant, my dad told regulars that we had tightened our belts and restructured a few things, painting himself as the captain who had steered the ship through the storm. My mom would text me late at night, quick bursts of affection and guilt. You saved us, Mija, I love you. But when someone praised the comeback in public, she just smiled and looked at my dad. While I was clipping coupons and declining happy hour invites from coworkers telling everyone I was working on a savings goal, Morgan and Noah were building a different kind of life. Morgan decided she was a wellness and lifestyle influencer. She posted sunrise yoga shots on the beach, rooftop cocktails, and endless day in my life clips hashtagging everything with Miami dreaming. Noah, the charismatic guy with perfect teeth and a gift for selling you on whatever he was already doing, built a small real estate business focused on short-term vacation rentals. They started showing up at Kings Harbor more often. Morgan floating through the dining room in dresses that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, Noah talking to my dad about maximizing the space and modernizing the brand. My parents lit up when they walked in. This is who will really take us to the next level. My dad told a server one night, gesturing at Morgan, while I wiped down the bar. Alyssa has her numbers job, but Morgan understands people. In their story, my contribution was a quiet footnote. The future of the restaurant was wrapped around my sister's perfect smile. As the loan balance shrank from terrifying to merely huge, business picked up. Tourists came back. The weather cooperated. Morgan's curated posts and Noah's discount deals kept the patio full most weekends. They convinced my dad to add live music Fridays, repaint the bar wall with neon art, and hire a photographer for menu photos. In every conversation, my parents framed it as Morgan and Noah swooping in to save the family business with their modern touch. I stood by the server station one afternoon, listening to my dad tell a cluster of cousins how we went through some lean years, but Morgan's ideas really turned it around. He didn't mention that without my signature on the refinance, there wouldn't have been a business to glow up. Later that night, taking trash out to the alley, I heard Noah in the office with my dad talking in that smooth business voice. We just need to clean up the paperwork so investors see Morgan and me as the owners, he said. We'll have Alyssa sign off when we do the engagement party. It'll look like a gift, and everyone loves a good story. My dad grunted agreement. I stood there, hands smelling like bleach, realizing they weren't plotting behind my back, as much as counting on me to keep being predictable. The first time I pushed back, it wasn't some cinematic explosion. It was me in the cramped office with the ancient window unit humming, setting the operating agreement Uncle Stanley had helped create on the desk. I tapped the paragraph that listed me as majority member of King Harbor Hospitality LLC. You can't just rewrite this without me, I said. And I'm not signing away my share so you can wrap it in a bow and call it a wedding present. My dad didn't even glance down. Why do you always make everything about money? He snapped. This is family. Your sister is getting married. The grill should go to her so it stays with the Kings. You have your job, your apartment, your own life. When I tried to mention how much I'd already paid the guarantees in my name, he cut me off with, "We all sacrificed. You're not special." Then he walked out, leaving the agreement on the desk like it was a menu printout. I sat there staring at the page, realizing I had been assuming that once the crisis passed, we'd stand on the same side of the story. They saw me clearly, just not as an owner. I was a convenient safety net. I might have stayed stuck in that fog of hurt if my cousin Haley hadn't stepped in. Haley worked in commercial lending at a regional bank up in Fort Lauderdale, and until then mostly existed in my head as the fun cousin who always showed up late but amazing to parties. After a barbecue where my parents bragged loudly about new investors and Morgan hinted they'd be taking over operations soon, Haley texted me, "Are you actually okay with what they're saying about the grill?" I sent her a picture of the operating agreement and a couple of loan statements, half embarrassed, half hoping I'd misunderstood everything. She called within minutes. In a calm banker voice I'd never heard from her, she walked me through what the documents truly meant. "Alyssa, on paper you own most of this thing," she said. "Your dad can't legally transfer control or refinance it into Morgan's name without your consent. He's already been in my branch trying. We told him he needs your signature." She paused. "He seemed very sure you'd go along." That conversation flipped a switch. For the first time, I stopped seeing those papers as a favor I'd done for my parents and started seeing them as leverage they'd assumed I'd never use. The emotional part still made me hesitate, and that's where my friend and coworker Jade came in. Jade started at the cruise line a few months after me and had a radar for when I was spiraling. One Tuesday night, when I was staring at a spreadsheet and hearing my dad's "You're not special" on repeat, she rolled her chair over and said, "You've been on the same cell for half an hour." Spill. I told her everything: the envelopes, the refinance, the way my parents were treating the restaurant like a prop in Morgan and Noah's engagement story, the assumption that I would just quietly sign. Instead of calling me dramatic, she asked, "Okay, what does the paperwork actually say?" She stayed late with me in an empty conference room while I spread out copies of the operating agreement loan, docs, emails, color coding sections with sticky notes. We built a timeline like it was a process improvement project. At the end, she said, "If this was one of our ship vendors trying to push you off a contract you paid to fix, you'd tell them to lawyer up and sit down. Your parents chose to make this a business deal when they put your name on those loans. You're allowed to treat it like one." That's how I ended up in a quiet office downtown, sitting across from Patrick Doyle, a business attorney Uncle Stanley recommended. I set my folders on his polished desk, took a breath, and walked him through 3 years of decisions without softening the ugly parts. Patrick didn't care about who hurt whose feelings. He cared about signatures, dates, and obligations. He traced the path from the original small business loan to the refinanced note under King Harbor Hospitality, circling clauses that gave me power, the right to approve major changes, to block transfer of controlling interest, to remove a managing member who acted against the company's interests. On paper, he said finally, "You're the majority owner and primary guarantor. Your father cannot unilaterally gift this company to anyone. If he's telling banks or investors otherwise, that's not just messy. That can cross into misrepresentation." He laid out options file notices with the state and county, clarifying who had authority notify the lender and landlord that no changes were authorized without my written consent, and be prepared to formally remove my dad as manager if he kept pushing. There will be fallout, he warned. They will say, "You chose money over family." I looked at the interest totals on one of the statements and realized they had chosen money over me a long time ago. The first time I challenged their version publicly was at my Aunt Rosa's annual beach cookout at Crandon Park. It was supposed to be casual plastic tables buried in sand, kids running in and out of the water, but this year everyone treated it like an unofficial engagement celebration. My dad stood by the food table with a plastic cup of beer, telling anyone who would listen how Morgan and Noah were taking Kings Harbor to the next level, how there were plans for a second location in Wynwood, how soon we'll be passing the torch to the next generation. I hovered near the coolers with a slim folder in my bag, feeling ridiculous and wired at the same time. When a cluster of relatives sat down at one of the picnic tables, and the story turned again to how Morgan and Noah were inheriting the restaurant as a symbol of my parents' faith, I heard the now familiar choice in my head: let his story harden into fact, or throw something more solid into the middle of it. My dad said, "We've already started the transfer. After the engagement dinner, it'll all be official, like it was a done deal." I sat down at the end of the bench, opened my folder, and slid the operating agreement onto the table between the potato salad and a stack of napkins, the section with my name as majority member highlighted in neon yellow. "That's not exactly what the paperwork says," I said, not raising my voice. Conversation stumbled. Aunt Rosa looked from the page to my dad. Haley across from me kept her expression neutral. She already knew. One cousin frowned and asked, "Wait, I thought you and Tia Deborah owned it? Uncle Richard?" My dad forced a laugh and called it boring legal language, insisting we all know what we mean. But the easy admiration in his little audience tightened into something more skeptical. My mom jumped in with a question about wedding colors. Kids ran past carrying plastic buckets, but the mood never quite returned to warm. That night, my phone buzzed with a handful of messages. "Didn't realize you were that involved. Is everything okay? Proof that for the first time, his version wasn't the only one people had heard. In the days leading up to the waterfront dinner, my schedule stayed the same, but my focus had shifted. On Wednesday morning, Patrick called to say the filings were live, a statement of authority with the state listing me, not my dad, as the person authorized to bind King Harbor hospitality. Letters to the lender and landlord flagging that any attempt to change ownership or refinance without my consent should be rejected. Notice to the alcohol licensing board that the company was in an internal dispute and no license transfers were to be processed. Haley forwarded an email from a colleague saying my dad had tried again to discuss refinancing into Morgan's name and had been politely reminded that my signature was required. Meanwhile, Noah posted a glossy tour of the restaurant on social media, calling it our place and teasing huge changes coming after the engagement party. Jade sent me the video with, "They're acting like you already signed. Remember, you do not owe them that." I watched Morgan stroll past the bar I'd scrubbed 1,000 times telling her followers how she had helped rebuild this place from nothing, and I realized she actually believed that. So when my dad slid that manila folder toward me at dinner and said the only thing missing was my signature, I was nervous, but not unprepared. My mom smiled too brightly at guests. My sister glowed in a white dress, and Noah squeezed her hand like the deal was already locked. I opened the folder and found exactly what Patrick had warned me about: transfer documents drawn up by some other lawyer, assigning all membership interests in King Harbor Hospitality to a new entity controlled by Morgan and Noah, with a line for me labeled former member, as if I were signing a polite goodbye card. "Just sign, Alyssa," my dad murmured, leaning close. "We can't toast properly until this is done." Jade sitting beside me as my +1 went completely still. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, but my voice came out steady. "I'm not signing this," I said. "And you already know any transfer you try without my consent is blocked." Patrick filed the paperwork last week. Morgan's smile snapped off. "You're seriously doing this right now," she hissed. "You're going to make my engagement dinner about you." Noah muttered something about me being ungrateful and short-sighted. I closed the folder and slid it back. "I already paid once to save this place," I said. "I'm not going to pay again by pretending none of that happened." I left before dessert, Jade's hand on my shoulder, the only steady thing in a room full of angry stares. My dad called me selfish loud enough that nearby tables went quiet. My mom cried, but never told him to stop. A couple of relatives followed us into the parking lot, asking if there was really legal stuff going on. I told them calmly that if they had questions about the documents, they should talk to the people who had tried to hide them from me. The next week, consequences started landing in ways my parents hadn't planned for. During a packed Sunday brunch, a man from the state's Department of Business and Professional Regulation walked in with a folder under his arm and asked to speak with whoever was authorized to make decisions for King Harbor Hospitality. My dad said that was him. The inspector shook his head and, using my full name, explained that state records showed otherwise. Staff watched from the service station as he delivered formal notice that any change of control, rebranding, or new alcohol license would be frozen until the internal dispute was resolved and updated financial statements were submitted. By that evening, cooks, servers, and bartenders were texting me, some upset, some weirdly relieved that someone had finally tapped the brakes. Then there was Noah's car, which turned into its own little lesson. He had been leasing a luxury SUV with custom rims and a sound system that rattled the windows, parking it right out front of the restaurant, as if it were part of the decor. At the engagement dinner, he'd bragged about how the new income stream from their restaurant would make upgrading to something even nicer easy. What he apparently hadn't been bragging about was falling behind on his payments. About a week after the inspector visit, while Morgan was filming an Instagram story in the parking lot about staying positive through negativity, a tow truck rolled in. The driver checked the plates, walked inside, and came back out with Noah trailing him, voice raised, waving his arms like he could argue the cables off his wheels. Guests and staff watched from the patio as the SUV was hooked up and hauled away. Noah left standing in his spotless sneakers with his phone in his hand and nothing to post. Within hours, a shaky phone video of the scene showed up in a local gossip group and spread faster than any of Morgan's edited content. For the first time, people outside our family saw cracks in the image they'd been selling. While my parents scrambled and blamed the negative energy I'd created, Patrick and I moved forward. Using the authority written into the operating agreement, we held a formal company meeting, just the two of us, because my parents refused to participate and voted to remove my dad as managing member for acting against the company's interest. Patrick drafted a precise letter explaining that they were no longer authorized to sign contracts, speak to lenders on behalf of the business, or present themselves as owners. If they wanted to stay at Kings Harbor, it would be as employees under a new general manager, not as bosses. I offered severance if they chose to leave instead, calculated based on what the company could actually afford once debts and my contributions were accounted for. My mom texted me once, "Your father says you have killed this family." I stared at the screen and thought about the night I found those envelopes, the years of payments, the times they told me to stop making things about money. Then I signed the documents appointing a seasoned general manager recommended by the hospitality group Patrick had introduced and forwarded everything to the payroll company. Once my dad was officially out, I had to decide what to do with Kings Harbor itself. I could have held on to it, but years of splitting myself between my parents' crisis and my own career had drained me in a way fancy cocktails and new menus couldn't fix. When a small hospitality group approached about buying a majority stake, I listened. They didn't care about our family history. They cared about the location, the liquor license, and the potential. Their offer would pay off the remaining loan, reimburse me for a big chunk of what I'd invested, and leave me with a minority equity stake and an optional consulting role. My parents were furious when they found out a sale was happening that did not turn them into main beneficiaries. Patrick explained calmly that once obligations and my documented contributions were covered, there was very little left to distribute, and nothing in our agreements guaranteeing them a payday. They complained to anyone who would listen that I was selling out the family. Nobody brought up the fact that they had tried to give the same asset away to Morgan and Noah for free. The deal closed. Kings Harbor kept its name, but got new signage, new menus, and a new story that had nothing to do with my dad's self-made legend. The aftermath for them looked a lot smaller than the grand punishment they probably describe when they talk about me now, but it was real. Without the restaurant to stand in front of, my parents moved out of the house I grew up in and into a small rental duplex on the edge of Hialeah, the type of place where parking is a daily argument and you hear your neighbor's TV through the wall. My dad, stripped of the title owner, struggled to find work that matched his ego and ended up on the line at a mid-tier chain off the highway, flipping frozen burger patties under fluorescent lights for a manager half his age. My mom picked up hostess shifts at the same place, their old roles repeated with less dignity and no control. Morgan and Noah had to move out of their brick-hell high-rise and into a smaller apartment farther west, suddenly filming content from a balcony that overlooked a parking lot instead of the bay. Noah lost a couple of real estate clients who didn't want to be associated with someone whose financial judgment had become a local meme. In every version of their story that drifted back through relatives, I was the villain, the bitter younger sister who took everything. What those versions left out was that if I hadn't stepped in, there would have been nothing left for anyone to fight over. My life got quieter, steadier, almost boring in the best possible way. With the sale proceeds and no loan to feed, I was able to leave my cramped place and buy a modest condo overlooking the water. Not the glossy downtown high-rises Morgan loved, but a solid building where the elevator worked, and the neighbors said hi. I left the cruise line and started a small operations consulting business, helping independent restaurants and food trucks get their systems in order before they ended up buried in envelopes like my parents. Jade became my first hire, handling marketing and client onboarding and rolling her eyes whenever she caught me answering emails at midnight. Haley sent me clients whose financials made bankers nervous but not hopeless, calling it balancing the family karma. I kept a minority stake in Kings Harbor as part of the sale, but I interacted with it the way I did any investment through quarterly reports and occasional strategy calls, not late night shifts and guilt. The emotional line I drew was sharper than any legal filing. After the last wave of messages from my parents and Morgan swung from begging to rage and back, I blocked their numbers. I did the same with Noah. I sent one clear email to the extended family saying I loved them but would no longer be attending gatherings where my parents or sister were present, that I didn't want updates about them, and wouldn't answer questions about the restaurant. Some relatives replied with support, some with variations of, "But they're still your family?" I didn't argue. I just stopped participating. Looking back, the turning point wasn't the inspector at brunch, the tow truck, or even the sale. It was the moment at that engagement dinner when I realized the only reason they believed they could erase me was because I had spent my whole life making myself small to keep peace. Paying down their debt taught me how easily people will use love as the excuse for you to carry the weight. Enforcing the agreements they signed taught me that love without respect is not a bill I'm required to keep paying. I don't forgive them. I don't miss them. I wish them just enough luck to get through their own days and nothing more. If you're listening to this and seeing your own family and mine, hear me clearly: protecting yourself is not betrayal. Tell me in the comments where your line in the sand would be. And if you want more stories of people finally choosing themselves, hit like and subscribe, because I'm done letting anyone else tell this story for me.